This time Suck, and in this video we are looking at cooperation between the superpowers. So first of all, let's look at attitudes of Khrushchev and Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis. As before the Cuban Missile Crisis, both leaders were forced to adopt a fairly aggressive foreign policy towards the other superpower. Now, Khrushchev was inclined towards peaceful coexistence, yet due to the rising pressure from Mao, who insisted that Khrushchev was not revolutionary enough, he had to be anti-Western to maintain Soviet dominance in the communist world. Now, Kennedy adopted a strong anti-communist stance because he had to appease his opposition. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides became much more willing to engage in diplomacy and discussions, and this is reflected in a number of policies throughout 1963. So next we'll look at Kennedy's attitude towards nuclear weapons and the USSR. And Kennedy's attitude about nuclear weapons was confirmed to him when General Leon Johnson, who was the director of the NSC Net Evaluation Committee, which is a component of the NSC which considered the potential impacts of nuclear war, presented to him the potential nuclear realities. And Johnson's report stated that the total number of casualties from a nuclear war between the USA and the USSR would amount to 93 million. So this meant that Kennedy started to focus on avoiding a nuclear war rather than winning one. So Kennedy's policies also extended beyond the USSR, as in 1963 the only nuclear powers were the UK, the USA, the USSR and France, and Kennedy wanted to keep it this way. So this meant that Kennedy began negotiations with the other powers with the aim of preventing the use of nuclear weapons. His assassination in November 1963 did stall some of these negotiations, yet they were not prevented. Now let's look at Khrushchev's attitude towards nuclear weapons in the USA, as Khrushchev did present his withdrawal from Cuba as a triumph, and the Russian newspaper Pravda said that Khrushchev had saved the world from nuclear catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis also meant that the USSR became more willing to base their relationship with the USA upon mutual restraint rather than brinkmanship. And whilst the USSR had managed to reconcile with Tito in Yugoslavia, they had lost China as an ally in Asia after the sino-soviet split of 1961, and this meant that there was further emphasis upon conciliation with the US rather than confrontation. So in order to improve these relationships, Khrushchev stopped supporting revolutionary movements abroad, and he embraced Kennedy's ideas for certain agreements. Now these included the number of countries with nuclear weapons would be limited, and the manner by which nuclear weapons could be tested was also restricted. Now Khrushchev was not able to conclude all of his ideas because of his removal from power in October 1964, however the negotiations did continue under the new leadership. So one of the things that was set up after the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Washington-Moscow Hotline. And in June 1963, a direct communication line was set up between the US and the USSR, and this meant that the leaders could reach each other 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. Now, whilst it was not instantaneous, it was much quicker than the previous methods, and it was designed to prevent the delays experienced in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And on August the 30th, the White House issued a statement that the new hotline would help reduce the risk of war occurring by accident or miscalculation. And this meant that its aim was to be used in emergencies only. And it signalled the new type of cooperation between the two superpowers. Now, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev used the hotline, and in fact it was Lyndon B. Johnson who first used it in 1967 when he alerted the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin that he was considering sending US air support to Israel in the Six-Day War. So the next treaty we need to look at is the Moscow Test Ban Treaty in August 1963. And after several years of negotiations between the two superpowers, the Moscow Test Ban Treaty was signed in August 1963, and whilst these were initially much larger in scope than negotiations, the one area that the Soviets and the Americans could agree on was the ways in which nuclear tests could occur. And this treaty agreed that above ground, underwater and outer space nuclear testing would be prohibited. However, the Moscow Test Ban Treaty has another name of the Limited Test Ban Treaty because of some of the omissions. And the main omission was that underground tests were not restricted, and this is because they are extremely difficult to detect and differentiate from earthquakes. France and China also refused to sign the agreement, and France continued to test its nuclear weapons in the South Pacific until the 1990s, and China, who had just started their nuclear program, continued until 1996. So there were many effects of the Moscow Test Ban Treaty, and it did represent the knowledge that a nuclear war was a possibility, and it took some steps to diminish these chances of such a war. The treaty also confirmed the willingness of Britain, the USSR and the USA to ease some of the tensions associated with the Cold War. It was the first collective agreement to establish limitations upon the nuclear arms race. Both superpowers accepted that on-site testing was not necessary, and this showed a certain level of trust between the two countries and removed a crucial restraint in the negotiations. And the Moscow Ban Treaty did open up the door to future agreements. And while many of the forthcoming agreements were bilateral between the US and the USSR, there were international agreements, and this did show an international commitment to limiting nuclear weapons. So the next treaty was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and this occurred in July 1968. But to know about this, we have to look at some of the advancements in the arms race which took place between the Moscow Test Ban Treaty and then the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So in 1963, the Kennedy administration continued to produce intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs. And this meant that their nuclear arsenal was superior to that of the USSR. However, by the late 1970s, there was more nuclear parity between the two superpowers, and this was because the Soviets had produced anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs. Now, this could intercept nuclear weapons, thus meaning that MAD, which is mutually assured destruction, was no longer effective. Now, in early 1967, McNamara persuaded Johnson not to develop an American ABM system prior to negotiations with the USSR, and instead they produced multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, which are also known easier as MIRVs, and this made the anti-ballistic missiles ineffective, and it brought the USSR to the negotiating table, and the anti-ballistic missiles were ineffective because it couldn't defend against multiple missiles. Now, the other issue was the significant cost of nuclear weapons, as the nuclear arms race had become extremely expensive, and this meant that some sort of arms control was required. But on the other hand, by the 1960s, nuclear technology had the possibility to become much more widespread, and the science of exploding and fusing atoms had entered public literature via academic articles, and private companies were also pursuing nuclear technology, as well as the government. China had also managed to successfully test their nuclear weapon in 1964, and all of this meant that a further treaty would be needed. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in July 1968, and all signatories agreed that they would not transfer to any recipient nuclear weapons or other nuclear devices, nor would they assist, encourage, or induce any non-nuclear state to manufacture nuclear weapons. Now, this meant that non-nuclear states would never be able to establish nuclear weapons arsenals by forming alliances with nuclear states. Now, the agreement did allow the signatories to develop research, though, of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, such as energy and electricity. Now, most countries in the UN did become signatories between 1968 and 1970. However, notable absences included India, Pakistan, Brazil, Argentina, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. Now, for political reasons, both France and China did not sign until 1992, but they did privately pledge that they would adhere to the terms of the treaty in 1968. But after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, further discussions were initiated. And the main reason for the talks was the fact that there was a significant cost involved in nuclear weapons, and a cutback would be beneficial for both sides as it would give them a chance to focus upon domestic issues. And this was especially relevant as the current wars were based on guerrilla warfare, in which nuclear weapons were useless. Now, there was also increasing pressure from other countries, as a nuclear war wouldn't only affect the country who were being targeted, as they were so big now that they would affect multiple countries. So the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia, which we will look at in the next video, and Johnson's decision not to run for re-election in 1968 did halt the negotiations briefly. However, Nixon's presidency saw a further effort to reduce nuclear weapons through the SALT negotiations, and we will look at that in future videos as well. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon.